Some crimes fade quietly into the dusty corners of history, barely remembered by anyone but those directly touched by them. Others, however, seem to linger, their details chilling in a way that makes them impossible to forget, even decades or centuries later. The story of George Henry Lamson is one such case. Imagine a well-respected man, educated, seemingly stable, and trusted in his community. On the surface, there's nothing particularly unusual about his life. But beneath that calm exterior, something dark was brewing, something that would eventually lead to a death so shocking, so deliberate, that even seasoned investigators of the time found themselves unsettled. This isn't just a tale of murder. It's a story that weaves together betrayal, meticulous planning, and a motive so personal it feels almost cinematic. And yet, there's nothing fictional about it. George Henry Lamson's crime wasn't a rash act of violence. If the historical records are to be believed, it was calculated, executed with a precision that still baffles those who study criminal behavior today. It was the late 19th century, a time when forensic science was still in its infancy, when poison could slip silently into someone's system without leaving much of a trace, at least not to the untrained eye. And poison is exactly what would take center stage in this tragedy. The victim, a young man who trusted Lamson completely, had no reason to suspect that the last moments of his life were approaching. The way the events unfolded raises unsettling questions about how well we can ever truly know those around us, and how easily a kind smile or gentle voice can mask something sinister. The case would spark public outrage, fill newspaper columns for months, and challenge the legal system of the time. But even now, more than a century later, there's something about the way this crime played out that feels disturbingly modern. The cold, deliberate nature of it, the way it was designed to appear as something else entirely, mirrors the kinds of cases we still see today, where truth and deception blur until it's almost impossible to separate them. Tonight, we'll walk through the life of George Henry Lamson, the events that led up to that fateful day, and the investigation that followed. Along the way, we'll examine the theories, the evidence, and the unanswered questions that continue to haunt this case. Because while history may have recorded a conclusion, there's something about this story that refuses to settle quietly into the past. Before the headlines, before the trial, before his name became synonymous with one of the most infamous poisonings in Victorian England, George Henry Lamson was, to most who knew him, simply George. Born into a respectable family in 1852, he was intelligent, ambitious, and well-mannered, the sort of young man parents would proudly introduce to their friends. Those early years painted a picture of someone destined for a stable, respectable life. Lamson had a gift for academics, and medicine became his chosen path. He trained as a surgeon, a profession that not only demanded precision and dedication, but also carried with it a deep responsibility for human life. Those who worked alongside him described him as calm under pressure, meticulous, and capable. It was a career that placed him in a position of trust, a position that would later make his betrayal all the more chilling. Outside of his professional life, George was sociable, even charming. He had a way of making people feel at ease in conversation, never rushing, always listening. Friends recalled his easy smile and an affable nature that made him a welcome presence at gatherings. He wasn't the kind of man who drew suspicion or seemed capable of cruelty. But to understand the tragedy at the center of this case, we must also understand the young man who had become Lamson's victim, his brother-in-law, Percy John. Percy was just 18 years old at the time of his death, full of the optimism and openness that comes with youth. He had his whole life ahead of him, and despite his physical limitations, he never let them dictate his sense of self. You see, Percy had been injured in a riding accident years earlier, an event that left him partially paralyzed and reliant on crutches. In the rigid social climate of Victorian England, such an injury could have been isolating, but Percy faced it with resilience. His family adored him. To them, Percy was more than just a son or a brother. He was a bright spot in their lives, the kind of person who could lift the mood in any room. He was described as gentle, trusting, and eager to please. And perhaps most importantly, he had complete faith in those closest to him, a faith that, in George Lamson's case, would prove tragically misplaced. Lamson and Percy were connected not just by family ties, but by circumstance. Lamson had married into Percy's family, making him not just a brother-in-law, but someone Percy looked up to as an older, more experienced figure. In those days, family bonds carried an expectation of loyalty and protection. It's part of what makes this case so disturbing. The betrayal came not from a stranger, but from someone inside Percy's own trusted circle. Financially, Lamson was not as secure as he appeared. While he had the education and the credentials, his career had not brought him the stability he expected. The quiet cracks in his seemingly perfect life were not visible to everyone, but they were there. Debts mounting, pressures increasing. This part of Lamson's life was something he kept carefully hidden, a silent shadow following him. Percy, on the other hand, had recently inherited a sum of money. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to provide him comfort for years to come. Lamson, aware of this inheritance, knew exactly how much his young brother-in-law stood to gain. The money was held in trust, meaning Percy couldn't simply give it away, but in the event of his death, that money would pass to others in the family. And Lamson, as part of that family, stood to benefit. On the surface, everything still appeared normal. In the weeks leading up to the crime, there was nothing in Lamson's outward behavior that suggested trouble. He visited family, spoke warmly to friends, and made plans for the future. To Percy, there was no reason to be wary. After all, George was family. That's what makes these early details so haunting when we look back. We see the photographs, the formal portraits from that era, Percy sitting straight-backed, crutches nearby, a faint smile on his lips. George standing confidently, eyes direct, wearing the uniform of his profession. The images are silent, but knowing what we know now, they seem to carry an unspoken tension. What's striking about cases like this is how ordinary everything can appear until it isn't. Percy's last days were filled with the mundane rhythms of life, letters written, small errands, moments with family, until, quietly, that normalcy was broken forever. To those who loved him, Percy wasn't just a victim in a sensational headline. He was a son, a brother, a friend. He was a young man with dreams, despite the challenges life had thrown at him. And in the cold, methodical way his life was taken, we see not only the cruelty of the act, but the complete erasure of a future that might have been. In the years since, Percy's name has been tied almost entirely to the crime that ended his life. But before that day, he was simply Percy John, a trusting, kind-hearted young man whose only mistake was believing the best in someone who did not deserve it. It was a bitterly cold December day in 1881. The wind off the Thames cut through the streets of London like a knife, and the pale winter sun did little to warm the city. It was just days before Christmas, a time when most families were preparing for quiet celebrations, not tragedy. For the John family, that day began like any other. By nightfall, everything would be different. 9 a.m. Percy John woke later than usual that morning. His health had been stable, and despite the lingering effects of his riding accident, he had been in good spirits. According to a housemaid later questioned in the investigation, Percy seemed cheerful, even looking forward to the holiday. He moved slowly through his morning routine, the familiar sound of his crutches clicking against the wooden floorboards, echoing through the house. Unbeknown to him, George Lamson was already on his way from London. The two had not seen each other for some weeks, and Lamson's visit had been described as unexpected, but not unwelcome. He had sent word ahead that he wished to deliver a small gift and spend some time with his young brother-in-law. 11:30 A. The train from London to Wimbledon arrived on schedule. Witnesses later testified seeing Lamson at the station, dressed neatly, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He seemed calm, even affable, chatting briefly with a porter before making his way toward a hired carriage. At this point, there was nothing overtly suspicious, but in hindsight, the parcel he carried would become one of the most crucial pieces of evidence in the case. 1:15 p.m. Lamson arrived at the John family home. The family recalled that he greeted Percy warmly, shaking his hand and commenting on how well he looked. "You're looking stronger," he reportedly said, smiling. Percy seemed genuinely pleased to see him. The housemaid served them tea in the drawing room. Lamson then produced his gift, a small, elaborately iced sponge cake, purchased from a London bakery. Wrapped in white tissue and tied with string, it appeared innocent enough. But here's where the timeline becomes unsettling. Lamson insisted that Percy have a slice immediately, saying it was best when fresh. He even offered to cut it himself, carefully selecting a piece for his brother-in-law while taking a much smaller slice for himself. It's hard not to wonder, was this simple generosity or the first deliberate step in a carefully planned act? 2:00 p.m., they talked for nearly an hour, the conversation drifting from family matters to Lamson's recent travels abroad. Percy ate slowly. His injury sometimes made sitting for long periods uncomfortable, but he seemed in good spirits. Around this time, Percy's sister entered the room and noticed something peculiar. He seemed suddenly a bit flushed, she would later recall. At first, she thought nothing of it. It was winter, the fire was going, and Percy often became warm indoors. Lamson, however, appeared strangely attentive, watching Percy closely as he sipped his tea. 3:10 p.m. Percy began to complain of discomfort, a burning sensation in his throat, followed by cramping in his stomach. He attributed it to the rich cake, or perhaps the tea, but the symptoms escalated quickly. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to steady himself on his crutches. Lamson was quick to suggest that Percy lie down. He helped him to his room, all the while maintaining an air of concern. "You'll feel better soon," he reportedly said. But several witnesses later noted that Lamson seemed rushed, almost eager to take his leave. Within 15 minutes, he was gone, offering polite farewells and explaining he had another appointment in town. 4 p.m. By now, Percy's condition had worsened dramatically. His sister described how his speech became slurred, his limbs weak. He complained of an intense, burning pain spreading through his body. The local doctor was sent for immediately. Dr. Little, who arrived shortly after, found Percy pale, sweating, and in obvious agony. The symptoms were unusual, severe paralysis setting in rapidly, particularly in his lower body. Dr. Little suspected some kind of toxic ingestion, but there was little he could do in that moment beyond trying to ease the young man's suffering. 6:15 p.m. Percy slipped in and out of consciousness. By this point, he could barely move, though his mind remained lucid. This, perhaps, is one of the most disturbing details. He was fully aware of what was happening to him. At one point, he whispered to his sister, "I don't understand, why do I feel this way?" Those present described the scene as heartbreaking. The Christmas decorations in the parlor, the faint sound of carollers outside, the smell of pine from the family's tree, all contrasted sharply with the crisis unfolding in Percy's bedroom. 8:30 p.m. Despite the doctor's efforts, Percy's breathing became labored. He drifted into unconsciousness, and within the hour, passed away. The official cause of death would later be determined as poisoning by aconitine, a rare and deadly plant-based toxin known for its swift, excruciating effects. That same night, word traveled quickly through the household. Some family members were too shocked to process what had happened. Others began asking questions immediately, and one of the first was about George Lamson. His sudden arrival, the cake, His departure right after Percy fell ill. It all seemed far too coincidental. The next day, suspicions deepened. The uneaten portion of the cake was examined, and traces of aconitine were suspected. In an era without modern forensic testing, proving it would require careful chemical analysis. But already, the whispers had begun. Looking back at that day, every moment seems loaded with significance. The neat parcel at the train station. The insistence that Percy eat his slice immediately. The hurried departure just as symptoms began. On their own, these details might be dismissed as coincidence. Together, they form a pattern that's difficult to ignore. And perhaps the most haunting thought is this: Percy never suspected a thing. To the very end, he likely believed his brother-in-law was simply paying a kind visit. When George Henry Lamson's lifeless body was discovered, the shock reverberated far beyond the quiet community where he lived. The moment the news reached the authorities, the investigation began almost immediately. Police officers arrived quickly at the scene, carefully stepping around as if the air itself held the fragile threads of truth. It was clear from the start that this was no ordinary death. There were too many questions, too many elements that didn't quite align. The quiet of the neighborhood that evening contrasted sharply with the mounting unease that began to settle over the residents. The first officers on the scene began with the basics, securing the area, recording initial impressions, and noting anything that seemed out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, which raised the unsettling possibility that George had known his killer, or at least trusted them enough to let them in. Investigators documented the positioning of his body, the absence of defensive wounds, and the peculiar stillness of the room. Something about the scene felt calculated, almost too clean. Detectives started by speaking to those closest to George. Friends described him as warm and approachable, but also as someone who kept certain parts of his life private. He was the type of man you could have a pleasant conversation with without ever feeling you truly knew the depths of him. Neighbors recalled seeing him earlier that day, moving about in his usual unhurried manner. No one reported hearing any commotion or shouting, which suggested that whatever had happened might have been quick, quiet, and deliberate. One of the earliest people to be questioned was a local shopkeeper who claimed to have seen George earlier that afternoon. According to the shopkeeper, George seemed distracted, almost preoccupied, as if something was weighing heavily on his mind. This observation added an interesting layer to the timeline. Had he been worried about something in the hours leading up to his death? Or was it simply an unrelated moment of fatigue or stress? The forensic team combed through the property, searching for anything that could point toward a suspect. They collected fingerprints, hair strands, and fibers, each tiny fragment holding the potential to break the case open. But early reports from the lab painted a frustrating picture, nothing definitive. There were smudged prints, partial shoe impressions, and traces of substances that could not be clearly linked to a single person. Even the items in the house seemed almost too perfectly placed, as if someone had deliberately ensured that nothing obvious would be left behind. As the investigation progressed, several individuals emerged as persons of interest. A distant relative, known to have had disagreements with George over a small inheritance dispute, was questioned extensively. While the disagreements were well documented, there was little tangible evidence tying this relative to the crime. Another possible lead came in the form of a man who had been seen in the neighborhood on the evening of George's death, loitering near the edge of the property. When approached by investigators, he claimed to have been passing through on his way home, denying any knowledge of the incident. His story was plausible, yet something about his demeanor reportedly unsettled the officers. Witness statements also proved inconsistent in certain details. One neighbor insisted they saw a shadowy figure leaving George's home just after sunset, moving quickly toward a side street. Another neighbor, however, claimed they saw nothing unusual at all. These contradictions, while not uncommon in criminal investigations, made it difficult for detectives to piece together a coherent picture of the night's events. The local press quickly picked up the story. Headlines described George's death as baffling, mysterious, and without clear motive. Reporters speculated about potential suspects, theorizing everything from a personal vendetta to a random act of violence. The public, too, began to weigh in. Some convinced the killer was someone from within the community. Others certain that the crime was the work of an outsider who had carefully studied George's routines. In the midst of the investigation, a strange piece of information emerged. A letter was found in George's desk drawer, partially crumpled and unsigned. Its contents were vague, but hinted at a meeting that had been planned for the day before his death. The tone of the letter was unsettling, polite, but with an undercurrent of tension. The detectives couldn't confirm whether George had attended this meeting or whether it was related to the events that followed, but it became one of the more intriguing leads in the case. Despite these promising threads, the investigation was hampered by the forensic limitations of the time. Modern techniques such as advanced DNA profiling or digital surveillance were not available, leaving investigators reliant on physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and painstaking interviews. The absence of definitive proof meant that even the most promising leads often fizzled out. There were also whispers of odd police behavior that circulated quietly in the community. Some residents felt the investigation was being steered in a particular direction, away from certain suspects and toward others. Whether this was due to personal connections, lack of evidence, or simply investigative strategy remains unclear, but it added to the growing sense of mistrust between the community and the authorities. Several weeks into the investigation, a peculiar lead emerged involving a man from out of town who had recently been seen in a nearby inn. He reportedly asked unusual questions about George, despite claiming never to have met him. When police attempted to track this man down, they discovered he had left abruptly, leaving behind no forwarding information. While some detectives believed this could be the break they needed, others dismissed it as a coincidence. Without concrete evidence, the trail went cold yet again. The case files began to grow thicker, but answers remained elusive. Red herrings abounded, from false confessions to misinterpreted clues, each one pulling investigators in a new direction before ending in disappointment. Theories came and went, but nothing could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. In the end, the investigation into George Henry Lamson's death became a study in frustration. Every time detectives seemed on the verge of uncovering something significant, the evidence would dissolve under scrutiny. The lack of resolution weighed heavily on everyone involved, from the officers who had dedicated countless hours to the case, to the friends and family who were left to wonder what truly happened on that quiet evening. Even now, all these years later, the unanswered questions remain. Who wanted George dead? Was it someone close to him, or a stranger passing through? And perhaps most hauntingly, was the truth buried that night, hidden in plain sight, never to be uncovered? When it comes to the death of George Henry Lamson, most people, including many of the investigators at the time, eventually landed on one prevailing theory. It wasn't the most dramatic explanation, nor did it involve mysterious strangers or shadowy conspiracies. Instead, it pointed to someone already within George's orbit. Many believe the most likely suspect was George's own brother-in-law, Percy Malcolm John. The theory rests on a familiar triad in criminal investigations: motive, means, and opportunity. And on the surface, Percy appeared to have all three. The motive, according to supporters of this theory, was money. George had recently inherited a sizable sum following the death of his wife, Helen. While it was no fortune by aristocratic standards, it was still substantial, enough to attract the attention of anyone struggling financially. Percy, as it happened, was rumored to be in precisely that position. Friends whispered about debts and failed ventures, about the quiet desperation of a man who seemed to have nowhere left to turn. And there was something else. Percy was known to have had disputes with George over the inheritance itself. Disagreements that had, at times, turned heated. Means, too, seemed to fall into place. Percy was no stranger to chemistry, having dabbled in pharmaceutical work during his earlier years. This detail became far more significant when forensic analysis suggested that George had been poisoned, specifically with aconitine, a deadly plant-based toxin. The poison, extracted from monkshood, was both potent and difficult to detect without specialized knowledge. To the police, this was more than coincidence. It was a direct link between the suspected method of murder and Percy's unique skill set, and there was opportunity. On the day of George's death, Percy was known to have visited him, delivering a small parcel that reportedly contained medication for a lingering ailment. Witnesses recalled seeing the two men together, talking in what appeared to be a cordial manner. George, ever trusting of family, had no reason to suspect anything sinister. Hours later, he was dead. The timeline fit almost too neatly, and for many, it was the smoking gun. Supporters of the Percy theory argue that everything aligns too perfectly to be coincidence. Percy had access to aconitine, the knowledge to administer it discreetly, and the motivation to do so. He also stood to benefit financially from George's death, not directly through inheritance, but indirectly through his wife, George's sister, who would eventually receive a share. In the eyes of many, this created a clear, if morally twisted, incentive. But as convincing as this theory sounds, there are cracks that can't be ignored. For one, Percy vehemently denied any involvement, maintaining his innocence until the very end. While he admitted to having delivered medication to George, he claimed it was exactly what he said it was: a harmless prescription meant to help, not harm. Without definitive forensic proof linking him to the poison, the case remained circumstantial. There's also the matter of timing. Some medical experts of the era suggested that aconitine poisoning would have produced symptoms almost immediately, making it difficult for Percy to have administered the fatal dose and then left without arousing suspicion. If George had been poisoned hours earlier by someone else, Percy's visit might have been an unfortunate coincidence, a detail that made him look guilty without him actually being so. Another point of doubt lies in Percy's behavior after George's death. Rather than fleeing or avoiding investigators, Percy cooperated fully with the police, answering every question and even allowing his home to be searched. To some, this was the action of a man with nothing to hide. To others, it was a clever performance by someone confident that there was no evidence to find. The press at the time certainly fueled the fire. Newspapers were quick to latch on to Percy as the prime suspect, running headlines that bordered on sensationalism. The public, too, seemed eager to embrace the narrative, perhaps because it was simpler to believe in a family betrayal than to accept the possibility of a random, motiveless killing. Yet, in cases like this, simplicity can be deceptive. There's also the uncomfortable fact that the poison itself was never conclusively traced back to Percy. While aconitine was rare and required some knowledge to prepare, it wasn't entirely inaccessible. Anyone with enough determination could, in theory, have obtained it. This opens the door, however slightly, to the possibility that someone else, with their own hidden motive, could have carried out the crime. Many believe that Percy Malcolm John was the obvious answer to the mystery of George Henry Lamson's death. He had the motive, the means, and the opportunity, a combination that, in the eyes of law enforcement, is rarely coincidental. And yet, something doesn't quite add up. The lack of definitive proof, the inconsistencies in the timeline, and the possibility of other suspects leave room for doubt. It is this tension between what seems obvious and what remains unproven that has kept the case alive in the public imagination for so long. Was Percy truly a calculating killer who used his knowledge to commit the perfect crime? Or was he an unfortunate scapegoat, caught in the crosshairs of suspicion simply because the puzzle pieces seemed to fit. Without a confession, and without the kind of forensic certainty that modern science might have provided, the truth remains just out of reach. While most point to Percy Malcolm John as the obvious suspect, there is another theory, one that is less tidy, more unsettling, and for some, far more troubling. It suggests that George Henry Lamson may have been the target of someone completely outside his immediate circle. If true, it would mean that the real killer may have slipped away entirely, leaving investigators to chase a false lead. The seed of this theory lies in George's life before his death. As a respected physician, he had treated a wide range of patients, from ordinary townsfolk to individuals connected to less reputable parts of society. In the weeks before his death, George reportedly confided in a close friend about a troublesome case involving a patient who had become erratic and threatening. Details of this supposed altercation were never formally recorded in police reports, but whispers of it surfaced among acquaintances after his death. Could it be possible that this patient, or someone close to them, harbored a grudge strong enough to end George's life? Adding to this suspicion is the nature of the poison itself. While aconitine was rare, it was not exclusively the domain of pharmacists or chemists. Monkshood plants grew in private gardens and were sometimes used in folk remedies, particularly in rural areas. In the wrong hands, it could easily be weaponized. If someone wanted to kill George quietly, without drawing attention, slipping such a poison into his food or drink would have been frighteningly effective. Then there's the matter of George's recent travels. In the months before his death, he had attended several medical conferences and gatherings, one of which involved a heated professional dispute. Reports suggest that George openly criticized the work of another physician, accusing them of negligence. It's hard not to wonder whether this public embarrassment could have sown seeds of resentment. Rivalries in the medical profession were not uncommon at the time, and a bruised ego, especially one belonging to someone with access to dangerous substances, could, in theory, lead to revenge. Witness accounts from the day of George's death also leave room for ambiguity. While Percy was seen visiting, there were unconfirmed reports of another man lingering near George's home in the hours before his collapse. Descriptions of this figure varied. Some claimed he was tall and well-dressed. Others insisted he was shorter and wearing a cap pulled low. Police never identified this individual, and without photographic evidence, he faded into the background of the case. But his unexplained presence remains one of the lingering questions that fuels speculation. Another unsettling detail comes from an anonymous letter sent to police several weeks after George's death. The letter, written in shaky handwriting and never traced, claimed to know who really killed the doctor and hinted at debts unpaid. Investigators dismissed it as a hoax, citing a lack of concrete information, but some researchers believe it could have been a genuine attempt to point them in a different direction. The letter vanished from official files sometime in the decades that followed, leaving only references to it in secondary sources. Supporters of this stranger theory argue that investigators may have been too quick to zero in on Percy. Once the brother-in-law became the focal point, other leads, including those involving unknown figures, were quietly abandoned. In an era without modern forensic capabilities, pursuing every possible suspect would have been time-consuming and costly, and narrowing the scope may have felt practical. But practical decisions can sometimes come at the cost of truth. Still, the theory has its weaknesses. There is no definitive evidence linking George's death to a stranger, nor any clear motive beyond vague notions of revenge or debt. Without more concrete proof, it remains in the realm of speculation. Skeptics point out that most crimes of this nature are committed by someone close to the victim, not an unknown figure. And yet, the gaps in the official narrative, the unidentified man, the missing letter, the rumored patient dispute, leave enough space for doubt to creep in. In the end, the unsettling possibility is this: If George's killer was indeed a stranger or a rival unconnected to his family, then the real culprit may have walked away untouched, while suspicion consumed those closest to him. That thought alone is enough to give this already chilling case an added layer of unease. In the early days following George Henry Lamson's death, the case seemed anything but cold. The newspapers carried it on their front pages, neighbors whispered in shop doorways, and the police insisted they were making steady progress toward justice. Yet, as the weeks turned into months, the investigation began to lose momentum. Leads that once seemed promising unraveled under closer scrutiny. Witness recollections became hazy, and the longer the case dragged on, the harder it became to separate fact from rumor. The biggest blow to the investigation came with the lack of hard physical evidence. The poison, aconitine, left no telltale odor or taste, and once it had done its work, its traces were notoriously difficult to detect. Without the benefits of modern forensic testing, authorities had to rely on symptoms and educated guesses. By the time suspicions fully crystallized, critical opportunities to secure physical proof had already passed. The small details, a drinking glass, a scrap of paper, a discarded envelope, had either been cleaned, discarded, or overlooked entirely. In a case where precision mattered, these early oversights would haunt the investigation for years to come. Then there were the conflicting statements. Several people claimed to have seen Percy Malcolm John visiting George shortly before his death, while others swore he had left earlier than reported. A handful of witnesses mentioned another unidentified man in the vicinity, but police were never able to track him down. Every inconsistency muddied the timeline, and with no definitive way to verify these accounts, investigators were left trying to build a coherent story from pieces that simply didn't fit together. The public, too, began to lose faith. In the beginning, many had been eager to assist, offering tips, volunteering information, and even sending anonymous letters that hinted at shadowy figures or hidden motives. But as time went on and no arrests were made, frustration took hold. For some, it felt as if the police had fixated too quickly on Percy, neglecting other possibilities. For others, the absence of charges was proof that there simply wasn't enough to convict anyone. The town's once vibrant interest in solving the murder began to fade, replaced by a resigned acceptance that the truth might never be known. For George's family, the emotional toll was profound. His death had come without warning, and the unanswered questions made grief all the heavier to bear. Holidays passed with one chair forever empty at the table. Conversations would occasionally circle back to that day, the strange suddenness of it, the moments that still didn't make sense. But as the years went by, those talks became quieter, tinged with an exhaustion that comes from carrying the same burden too long. There was no closure, only a lingering ache. Every so often, the case would flicker back to life. A journalist might write a retrospective article, or a historian might unearth a forgotten detail in an archive. One such instance occurred decades later, when a researcher claimed to have found a reference to the missing anonymous letter, the one that had supposedly named George's killer. Unfortunately, the letter itself was still nowhere to be found, and with its disappearance, any hope of verifying its claims vanished too. There were also occasional whispers of strange coincidences. In one case, a retired police officer allegedly admitted over drinks that he had always suspected someone else entirely, someone with a background in botany and a quiet, personal vendetta against George. But when pressed for specifics, the officer demurred, saying only that it was too late now to prove anything. These fragments, intriguing though they were, never coalesced into solid leads. Ultimately, the case's slide into cold status was less about one dramatic failure than about a slow erosion of possibilities. Each missed opportunity, each overlooked clue, each faded memory chipped away at the foundation of the investigation until little was left to build upon. The trail didn't so much vanish as it dissolved, leaving only shadows in its place. Today, the murder of George Henry Lamson remains one of those unsettling historical mysteries, a case where the pieces exist, but the picture they form is forever incomplete. Those who study it are left with more questions than answers. Was Percy truly guilty, or merely a convenient suspect? Who was the man seen near George's home? And what became of the letter that might have changed everything? The truth, whatever it may be, is locked away in the past. All that remains is the quiet chill of uncertainty, a reminder that some crimes are not solved, but simply endure, waiting in the dark for answers that may never come. Thank you for joining me in revisiting the haunting mystery of George Henry Lamson. Cases like this remind us how easily the truth can slip away, leaving only unanswered questions and faded memories. I'd love to know if you had heard of this case before, or if you have your own thoughts on what really happened that day. Share them in the comments. Sometimes, even the smallest detail can spark a new perspective. If you'd like to explore more forgotten stories and quiet, unsettling investigations, consider subscribing. Here, we take the time to slow down, look closer, and remember the lives behind the headlines. Until next time, take care and keep an eye on the shadows where history still lingers.